For 80 years, one question has sparked heated debates in smoky veteran halls, engineering conferences, and aviation museums across the world. Which propeller-driven fighter was truly the fastest in World War II? The answer is the North American P-51H Mustang, reaching 487 miles per hour in documented level flight. But that simple answer tells only part of a much larger story, a story of 8 extraordinary aircraft that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with piston engines and propellers, each one representing the desperate innovation of nations fighting for survival. Based on official test data, wartime performance reports, and verified trials, these 8 fighters stand above all others in terms of pure speed. They weren't paper projects or prototypes gathering dust in hangars. Every aircraft on this list saw production, and most faced enemy fire in actual combat. Their speeds came from cutting-edge engineering, relentless testing, and the kind of innovation that only happens when everything is on the line. What makes their story remarkable isn't just the numbers. It's the men who flew them, the engineers who built them, and the impossible challenges they overcame. In World War II, speed wasn't about records or bragging rights. It was about survival. An extra 10 miles per hour could mean catching an enemy bomber before it dropped its deadly cargo on innocent civilians below, or escaping when outnumbered and low on ammunition. Speed determined who lived to see another sunrise and who became another name carved into memorial stone. Let's count down from number 8 to the absolute fastest propeller fighter that ruled the skies in 1945, and discover the stories behind the machines that represented the peak of human achievement in one of history's darkest hours. Let's follow beyond history, where historical stories are told from a different perspective, slower and deeper, to answer and listen to questions in the flow of history. Please like and subscribe to the channel. Your support is a great source of motivation to help us send everyone better quality products. The winter sky over Germany in late 1944 stretched pale and cold above the frozen landscape below. In the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190D9, a young Luftwaffe pilot, we'll call him Franz, though his real name has been lost to time, pushed the throttle forward and felt something different from the earlier fighters he'd flown. The Junkers Jumo 213 engine responded with a deep roar that seemed to come from somewhere far ahead, and the aircraft leapt forward with surprising eagerness despite the dire circumstances that brought it into service. The nose of the Dora 9, as pilots called it, stretched long and sleek before him, completely different from the blunt profile of earlier FW-190s. That elongated cowling housed an inline engine rather than the radial that had powered previous variants, and it gave the aircraft a predatory appearance that matched its purpose. Capable of reaching 426 miles per hour in level flight, it could catch most Allied fighters and climb to where the heavy bombers cruised. The FW-190 series had been a thorn in the Allies' side since 1941, when the radial engine versions first appeared over France and gave British Spitfire pilots an unpleasant surprise. But by 1943, the nature of aerial warfare had shifted dramatically. American and British bombers flew in massive formations at altitudes where the earlier radial engine 190s, magnificent as they were at lower levels, struggled to maintain performance. German engineers made a bold decision. They replaced the reliable BMW radial engine with the Junkers Jumo 213A inline power plant, which required extending the nose to accommodate its different dimensions. The transformation was dramatic. Production began in August 1944, and by war's end, over 700 of these long-nose variants had rolled off increasingly threatened assembly lines. According to accounts from surviving pilots, the Dora 9 proved to be a revelation at altitude. One might imagine a letter home describing how the supercharger kept the engine performing strongly at 25,000 feet, where earlier models had gasped for air. The aircraft retained the FW-190's legendary roll rate, Pilots could snap from one bank to another faster than most Allied fighters could follow, and the robust construction that might bring you home even with battle damage. But technical excellence couldn't overcome impossible odds. By late 1944, no matter how capable the WWII was, there were never enough of them, never enough fuel, and never enough experienced pilots. In those final desperate months, these sleek fighters battled against overwhelming numbers in defense of a Germany that was already crumbling. The young men who flew them, many barely old enough to need a razor, climbed into their cockpits knowing the war was lost, yet they flew anyway. The FW190D9 proved that even facing inevitable defeat, human ingenuity persists. It arrived too late and in too few numbers, but those who flew it knew they were flying something exceptional, something that represented both the heights of German engineering and the tragedy of its timing. Summer 1944 brought a new terror to southern England. The V-1 flying bombs, buzz bombs or doodlebugs, as people called them, came screaming across the channel with their distinctive pulse jet engines, each carrying a ton of high explosives. When their fuel ran out, they simply fell from the sky onto whatever neighbourhood lay beneath. At a Royal Air Force base in southern England, squadron leader David Fairbanks, a name representing many pilots who faced this threat, didn't wait for sector control's orders when air raid sirens began their wailing. He was already sprinting toward his Hawker Tempest 5, calculating the speeds that might determine success or failure. The buzz bombs flew at roughly 400 miles per hour. His Tempest could reach 435 miles per hour in level flight. That margin wasn't generous, but it might be enough. The Tempest had evolved from the earlier Hawker Typhoon, which had proven excellent for ground attack, but disappointing as a pure fighter, limited by a thick wing that restricted top speed and altitude performance. Hawker's chief designer, Sidney Cam, approached the problem fresh with a thinner wing profile and the massive Napier Sabre engine, a 24-cylinder powerhouse producing over 2,400 horsepower that created a sound pilots described as mechanical thunder. Entering service in April 1944, the Tempest arrived at precisely the right moment to face the V-1 threat. At low altitude, where the flying bombs cruised, the Tempest excelled. Fast, stable, and deadly. When Fairbanks slammed his throttle forward, the Sabre's cylinders screamed in response, and the Tempest leapt ahead with violent acceleration. The chase demanded precise judgment. Get too close to a V-1 before shooting it down, and the explosion might destroy both aircraft. Some pilots developed what seemed an impossible technique until you witnessed it. They would slide their Tempest's wingtip under the V-1's wing, maintaining just inches of separation while flying at 400 miles per hour, then flip their aircraft sharply to knock the flying bomb's wing upward. According to accounts from pilots who attempted this maneuver, it required nerves of steel. One might imagine a pilot named Robert Hughes telling his squadron mates over warm beer that evening, hands still trembling from adrenaline, how he'd positioned his wing within inches of the flying bomb, knowing one mistake would destroy them both. When executed successfully, the V-1's gyroscope would lose orientation, and the weapon would spiral harmlessly into the channel, saving countless lives without firing a single shot. Tempest squadrons accounted for over 800 V-1s during that terrible summer, more than any other fighter type. But the aircraft proved far more versatile than just a flying bomb interceptor. In air-to-air combat against German fighters, it became a feared opponent, combining exceptional speed with heavy firepower, 4 20mm cannons that could shred an enemy aircraft in a single burst, and handling characteristics that earned pilots deep respect. Wing Commander Roland Beaumont, who flew Tempests operationally, supposedly wrote in post-war accounts that he would choose a Tempest over any other RAF fighter. It was fast, it was tough, and most importantly, it brought pilots home. In a war where tomorrow was never guaranteed, that last quality mattered more than raw performance numbers alone ever could. Everyone knew the Spitfire's story, how in summer 1940, young pilots in their graceful fighters had turned back the Luftwaffe and saved Britain from invasion. The Spitfire had transcended its role as mere aircraft to become a symbol, an icon embodying British determination under fire. But the Mark 14 that entered service in early 1944 bore little resemblance to those earlier Spitfires from the Battle of Britain. When test pilot Geoffrey Quill first advanced the throttle on a Griffin-powered prototype, he experienced something entirely new. The Rolls-Royce Griffin engine didn't purr like the familiar Merlin. It growled deep and powerful, like something barely contained. The difference was stark. Early Spitfires had used Merlin engines producing roughly 1,000 horsepower, already impressive for their era. The Mark 14's Griffin 65 generated over 2,000 horsepower, more than doubling available power and creating engineering challenges that took months to solve. That much power couldn't simply be bolted to an existing airframe. The entire aircraft required strengthening. Tail surfaces needed enlarging to handle the massive torque, and the airframe demanded reinforcement against forces that would have torn earlier Spitfires apart. Engineers working on the project might have faced frustrating moments. One could imagine a chief engineer telling his team how, during initial testing, the tail section flexed alarmingly under the Griffin's power, forcing them back to their drawing boards repeatedly before the structure could withstand what the engine produced. The result of this extensive work was an aircraft capable of reaching 446 miles per hour in level flight with rocket-like climb performance. The Griffin's power produced acceleration that reportedly shocked German pilots accustomed to outrunning earlier Spitfire variants. At altitude, where previous Spitfires had struggled, the Mark 14 excelled, making it particularly effective at intercepting high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft and the new German jets beginning to appear over Europe. Squadron leader James Johnson, one of the RAF's leading aces, may have described encounters where German pilots, using tactics successful against earlier Spitfires, received nasty surprises. One might imagine him recounting an engagement over France where a Focke-Wulf 190 pilot attempted his standard escape, diving away at full throttle, expecting to leave a Spitfire behind. But the Mark 14 stayed with him, even gaining slightly, and the German pilot likely experienced shock seeing a Spitfire still on his tail. First flown in January 1943, the Mark 14 entered squadron service in early 1944, arriving for the crucial months leading to D-Day and Europe's liberation. Over 900 were built, serving with distinction until war's end. They represented something significant, the ultimate evolution of one of history's most successful fighter designs, proving that excellence could be continuously refined even under total war's terrible pressures. Out in the Pacific, where carrier warfare determined the campaign's course across vast ocean expanses, Grumman's engineers faced a unique challenge. The Navy's escort carriers, small jeep carriers invaluable for supporting amphibious operations and hunting submarines, were too small for the heavy, powerful fighters dominating fleet carriers. The Navy needed the most powerful fighter that could operate from the smallest possible deck. The story suggests that Leroy Grumman, whose company had already produced the rugged Wildcat and excellent Hellcat, gathered his design team in 1943 with a simple question. What if they built the smallest, lightest airframe that could handle their biggest engine? The answer would become the F-8F Bearcat, proving to be one of the war's most remarkable fighters. The Bearcat's heart was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a massive radial producing 2,100 horsepower, the same engine powering the much larger P-47 Thunderbolt. Grumman's engineers wrapped the smallest possible airframe around that enormous power plant, eliminating every unnecessary ounce, obsessing over each detail. The result looked almost comically compact, with a fuselage barely accommodating the engine and cockpit, and wings that seemed inadequate for their task. But when that aircraft flew, it proved that sometimes less truly is more. The Bearcat could reach 455 miles per hour in level flight, but more impressively, it climbed to 10,000 feet in just 94 seconds, faster than any American fighter of its era. Its roll rate was phenomenal, and despite compact dimensions, it carried powerful armament of either 420mm cannons or 6.50 caliber machine guns. Commander Fred Trapnell, one of the Navy's most respected test pilots, might have described his first flight as akin to strapping himself to a rocket with wings. One could imagine him explaining how the aircraft didn't climb, but leapt into the sky, how controls proved so responsive that inexperienced pilots often over-controlled initially. But once a pilot understood the Bearcat's personality and learned to think as fast as it could move, the aircraft would do absolutely anything requested. The Bearcat's timing was unfortunate from one perspective. Entering service in February 1945, it arrived far too late for World War II combat. Only 24 aircraft had reached operational squadrons when Japan surrendered in August, and none fired their guns at enemy aircraft. From another perspective, perhaps this was fortunate. It meant young men who would have flown these fighters got to go home to their families instead of joining the long casualty lists. Those who flew Bearcats in post-war years spoke of them with reverence. Test pilots called it the finest handling fighter of the propeller era. It became the Blue Angel's mount, thrilling crowds with spectacular performance. It set multiple time-to-climb records standing for decades, and veteran pilots who had flown everything from Wildcats to jets maintained that nothing in the piston engine era matched the Bearcat's pure joy of flight. One could imagine Lieutenant Commander John Ramage telling younger pilots that in a dogfight, the Bearcat could turn inside anything that flew, and if you needed to escape, outnumbered or low on ammunition or simply scared, nothing could catch you. That combination created very confident pilots, and confidence in combat was worth its weight in gold. The F-8F represented the answer to how far you could push the piston engine fighter concept by abandoning old assumptions. The answer proved to be remarkably far. Major Hans Dortenmann watched helplessly from his Focke-Wulf 190's cockpit as American B-17 bombers droned overhead at 32,000 feet. At that altitude, where air was desperately thin, his aircraft wallowed through the sky like an exhausted swimmer. By the time he'd struggled up to the bomber's altitude with precious fuel already spent, his aircraft could barely maneuver, and escort fighters surrounding the bombers could outperform him easily. Germany desperately needed a fighter that could operate effectively where the bombers flew, that could fight at altitudes where most aircraft simply gave up. The answer was the Ta-152H, a specialized high-altitude interceptor representing some of Germany's finest engineering work, produced under increasingly desperate circumstances. Built for one purpose, to dominate the thin air above 40,000 feet where Allied bombers considered themselves relatively safe, designer Kurt Tank's team created an aircraft with wings spanning nearly 48 feet, much longer than standard fighters. They equipped it with a pressurized cockpit so pilots could function at extreme altitude, and powered it with the Junkers-Jumo 213E engine, featuring a sophisticated two-stage supercharger that could force sufficient air into the engine to maintain power where other aircraft would fail. The result could reach 469 miles per hour, and more importantly, could outclimb, outrun, and outmaneuver virtually any opponent above 40,000 feet. At those heights, where you could see Earth's curvature and the sky above faded from blue to deep purple, the Ta-152H reigned supreme. A test pilot at the Rechlin Test Center might have reported that at 42,000 feet, air is so thin that even with proper oxygen flow, your mind feels strange. Most fighters at that altitude become helpless. They wallow and slip, controls mushy, engines struggling. But in the Ta-152H, according to such accounts, you owned that piece of sky, with controls remaining responsive and engines pulling strongly. But like so many late-war German designs, by the time production began in November 1944, the strategic situation had already turned irreversible. Production began in November 1944, when Germany's situation was already desperate. Fewer than 70 production aircraft were completed before war's end, with perhaps only 43 delivered to operational units. Even fewer saw actual combat. Those that did made impressions. On April 14, 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender, Oberfeldwebel Willy Reschke, flying a TAR-152H, was scrambled when Hawker Tempest fighters were reported attacking railway yards near Ludwigslust. In the engagement that followed, Reschke shot down a Tempest flown by Warrant Officer Owen J. Mitchell of No. 486, New Zealand Squadron, before successfully disengaging. What made this victory particularly remarkable was that it occurred at low altitude, where the Tempest was specifically optimized for combat, yet the TAR-152H still proved superior. This engagement demonstrated that the aircraft's capabilities extended beyond its primary high-altitude role, though such combats remained rare in the war's final weeks. The TAR-152H symbolized something tragic about the war's final year. Germany still possessed brilliant engineers and brave pilots, could still produce remarkable aircraft, but lacked fuel to fly them, infrastructure to support them, and strategic situation to employ them effectively. A design that might have changed everything in 1943 became merely a footnote in 1945, proving that excellence alone couldn't overcome total war's terrible arithmetic. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding the legendary 56th Fighter Group, gathered his pilots in their English base's briefing room in late 1944. These men had flown P-47 Thunderbolts from the beginning, stayed with the Jug, when other groups transitioned to the lighter, longer-ranged P-51 Mustang. They loved their big, tough fighters, trusted the massive radial engine to bring them home even when battle damage would have doomed liquid-cooled aircraft. But Zemke's expression was grave as he addressed them. According to accounts from that period, he might have explained how the war had changed, that Germany now fielded jets, Me-262s and R-234s, and their current D models couldn't catch them. If they couldn't catch them, they couldn't kill them. When asked what they needed, his answer was simple: something faster. The response was the P-47M, a specialized Thunderbolt variant designed specifically for catching and destroying Germany's fast, high-altitude fighters and jets. Republic Aviation's engineers took the proven P-47D and made it faster through various modifications. A specially tuned Pratt & Whitney R-280057 engine with improved turbocharger system, water injection for emergency power, and weight-saving measures. The result could reach 472 miles per hour in level flight, fast enough to catch almost anything the Luftwaffe operated. Only 130 P-47Ms were built, entering service in December 1944, all going to one unit, Zemke's 56th Fighter Group, the only outfit operating the type. Initially, these specialized Thunderbolts proved temperamental. High-performance engines demanded meticulous maintenance, and early models suffered severe engine failures that grounded the entire fleet for weeks, while engineers identified and fixed problems. Captain Fred Christensen, one of the 56th's leading aces, might have described his first P-47M flight as shocking. One could imagine him explaining how he'd flown standard Thunderbolts since 1943, knew them thoroughly, understood their strengths and limitations. But when he first pushed the M model's throttle to military power, then activated water injection for emergency boost, the acceleration literally pinned him back in his seat. It wasn't like the difference between walking and running, it was like the difference between riding a horse and riding lightning. Once mechanical issues were resolved, the P-47M proved devastatingly effective. It combined the Thunderbolt's legendary toughness and heavy armament, 8.50 caliber machine guns that could saw aircraft apart, with speed matching or exceeding virtually any German piston engine fighter. More importantly, it could catch early jets during vulnerable moments, particularly during takeoff and landing when they were slow and their temperamental engines most likely to fail. Lieutenant Colonel David Schilling, another of the 56th's top pilots, might have recounted catching an Me-262 near Berlin during its landing approach. One could imagine him describing how normally catching a 262 was frustrating exercise. They were simply too fast. But in the M model, they had speed to stay with the jet through its landing pattern, and his wingman got a good burst just as the jet's wheels touched down. The 56th Fighter Group flew their P-47s until war's end, accumulating kills against both conventional fighters and early jets, earning reputation as the most feared American fighter unit over Germany. The P-47M represented the absolute limit of the basic Thunderbolt design. Any more performance required starting over with a completely new aircraft. It was the Jug's final roar, and it made the Luftwaffe tremble. When Allied intelligence officers first saw reconnaissance photographs of the Dornier Do-335 in 1944, reportedly more than one analyst thought they were viewing a photographic error, perhaps two aircraft accidentally captured in the same frame, creating the illusion of a single machine. Surely no one would build a fighter with engines at both front and rear. Surely that was impossible. But the Do-335 fail, Arrow in English, was very real, representing one of the war's most innovative aircraft designs. Dornier's engineers had identified a fundamental problem with conventional twin-engine fighters. Wing-mounted engines created tremendous drag, making aircraft slower and less maneuverable than single-engine designs. Their solution was radical. Place one Daimler-Benz DB603 engine conventionally in the nose, driving a tractor propeller, and mount a second identical engine behind the pilot driving a pusher propeller at the tail through an extension shaft. The concept was brilliant in its elegance. By eliminating wing-mounted engines, the Do-335 could have a clean, streamlined fuselage, no draggier than a single-engine fighter, but with twice the power. The result could reach 474 miles per hour in level flight, faster than almost anything else flying, while carrying heavy armament and armor that would make it formidable in combat. A Dornier engineer's technical report that survived the war might have described the engineering as elegant in its simplicity. One could imagine documentation explaining how mounting the rear engine behind the pilot with a carefully designed extension shaft driving the tail propeller eliminated all drag penalties of wing-mounted engines, creating an airframe as clean as a single-engine fighter, but with two engines' power. But reality proved more complicated than theory. The push-pull configuration's complexity created unique challenges. The rear engine generated tremendous heat, making the cockpit nearly unbearable during long flights. The pusher propeller created unusual handling characteristics requiring extensive pilot training. Most dramatically, the aircraft needed a unique emergency escape system. Explosive bolts would jettison the rear propeller and tail surfaces in a bailout, allowing the pilot to eject without being struck by propeller blades, a system that worked theoretically but must have seemed terrifying to contemplate. Development delays meant the first prototype didn't fly until October 1943. The first prototype didn't fly until October 1943, by which point Germany's window of opportunity had already closed in a war already turning decisively against Germany. Production aircraft reached test units only in early 1945, when Germany's fuel supplies were nearly exhausted and Allied air superiority was absolute. Perhaps only 37 Do-335s were completed before war's end, and none saw genuine combat deployment, though several participated in high-speed trials confirming their exceptional performance. A test pilot at the Rechlin Evaluation Center might have recorded impressions of flying the Feel as surreal. One could imagine descriptions of having the forward engines roar right ahead, vibrating through the airframe while simultaneously feeling the rear engine's push, a constant pressure urging you forward. When advancing both throttles to maximum power, according to such accounts, the acceleration was unlike anything else in the Luftwaffe inventory. After the war, Allied technical teams captured several Do-335s and shipped them to Britain and America for evaluation. Captain Harold Watson, a test pilot at Wright Field who reportedly flew one captured example, might have written that the aircraft was fast, stable, and powerful, with excellent visibility and well-harmonized controls. One could imagine him concluding that if the Luftwaffe had fielded these in quantity in 1943 instead of 1945, the air war over Europe would have been very different. The Do-335 symbolized German engineering at its most innovative and most desperate, a brilliant solution arriving far too late, built in numbers too few to matter. It proved that excellence alone couldn't win wars, that timing and resources and strategic situation mattered as much as technical superiority. But it remains one of the war's most fascinating aircraft designs, reminding us that even in desperate circumstances, human ingenuity perseveres. Chief Test Pilot Bob Chilton climbed out of the P-51H after his first flight on February 3, 1945, removed his flight helmet, and according to witnesses, said just 3 words: "This is it." Everyone standing on the tarmac at North American's facility understood exactly what he meant. After years of incremental improvements, after countless testing hours and refinement, after producing the already excellent P-51D that had helped win the air war over Europe, North American had finally achieved perfection. They had created an aircraft representing the absolute pinnacle of piston engine fighter design. The P-51H wasn't simply a modified P-51D with a more powerful engine. It was a comprehensive redesign incorporating everything North American's engineers had learned from 5 years of Mustang production and combat experience. They stripped nearly 1,500 pounds from the airframe through lighter construction techniques, a redesigned fuselage reducing weight without sacrificing strength, and ruthless removal of any non-essential equipment. They installed the Packard 5 16509 engine, the American-built Rolls-Royce Merlin, with water injection for emergency power. The result could reach 487 miles per hour in level flight, so close to 500 that pilots claimed they'd touched that magical number, even if official records showed otherwise. But as impressive as that top speed was, it wasn't the P-51H's most important characteristic. The weight reduction transformed handling in ways that amazed even veteran Mustang pilots. It rolled faster than any previous variant, climbed more quickly, and maneuvered more nimbly, yet retained the P-51's famous range, over 850 miles on internal fuel alone, sufficient to escort bombers deep into enemy territory with fuel remaining to fight returning home. According to accounts from pilots who flew multiple Mustang variants, the difference was striking. One might imagine a composite pilot explaining how he'd flown every Mustang from the B model onwards. The D was excellent, balanced, reliable, fast enough to catch anything the Luftwaffe had except their jets. He trusted the D with his life, and it never failed him. But the H was something else entirely. It might be compared to the difference between a thoroughbred horse and a racehorse, both magnificent, but one built for a very specific purpose with everything refined to perfection. Every control input in the H brought immediate response. You thought about a maneuver, and the aircraft was already executing it. The strategic implications were enormous. By early 1945, the European war was winding down, but the Pacific War was expected to continue for at least another year, possibly longer. American planners prepared for invading Japan itself, an operation everyone knew would be incredibly costly. The P-51H was designed specifically for that campaign. It could escort B-29 superfortresses on long missions from Marianas bases to Japanese targets, could outfight anything the Japanese could field, and could do it while maintaining the reliability pilots demanded. Staff officers working on Air Force planning might have explained the thinking. The brass understood that invading Japan would be the war's bloodiest operation. But with the P-51H, they could dominate the skies over Japan completely. Every B-29 would have fighters staying with them for entire missions, all the way to Tokyo and back, and those fighters could defeat anything the Japanese threw at them. That kind of air superiority saves lives, both airborne and on the ground. Production began in February 1945, and by August, when Japan surrendered following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 555 had been delivered. Production timing meant they missed European combat. That war ended in May. And while some reached Pacific units, none engaged in actual air combat before war's end. In one sense, this was unfortunate for historians and aviation enthusiasts who will forever wonder how the P-51H would have performed in combat. In another sense, perhaps it was fortunate. Another group of young men got to come home to their families instead of joining casualty lists. According to accounts from that period, one might imagine a pilot assigned to the 82nd Fighter Squadron reflecting years later how they were training for Japan's invasion when news came of atomic bombs and Japan's surrender. Their squadron had just received P-51Hs, scheduled to deploy to Iwo Jima in September. They would have been flying over Tokyo by October. Part of him, the pilot part that had trained for years, wondered what combat in this incredible machine would have been like. But mostly, he was grateful they never had to find out. The Air Proving Ground Command at Eglin Field issued its final report on the P-51H in October 1946. The document, written in official technical evaluation's dry language, nevertheless couldn't quite hide test pilots' enthusiasm. They praised its speed and range, its stability as a gun platform, its excellent visibility and responsive controls. They called it the finest handling Mustang ever built, meaning they were calling it one of the finest handling fighters of the entire piston engine era. On August 15, 1945, when announcement came that Japan had surrendered and the war was finally, truly over, pilots across the Pacific might have experienced similar moments. One could imagine a lieutenant sitting in a P-51H's cockpit, ready for a training flight when the news came over the radio. At first, not quite processing it, they'd been at war so long that peace seemed impossible. But then looking around at other pilots climbing from cockpits, shouting and embracing, and it would hit. They'd won. Looking at the instruments, at the cowling's clean lines stretching ahead, at propeller blades catching afternoon sunlight, one might think, this is what winning looks like. They'd built something so advanced, so nearly perfect, that the enemy simply couldn't match it. These 8 fighters, the FW190D-9, Hawker Tempest 5, Spitfire Mark 14, F-8F Bearcat, TAR-152H, P-47M Thunderbolt, Do-335 Feel, and P-51H Mustang, represented the absolute pinnacle of propeller-driven aviation technology. They were designed and built during humanity's most desperate conflict, when nations poured unlimited resources into gaining even the slightest advantage in the sky, when stakes couldn't have been higher, and when failure meant not just defeat, but potential annihilation. What's remarkable when viewing these aircraft together is how close their top speeds were. Just 61 miles per hour separated the FW190D-9 at number 8 from the P-51H Mustang at number 1. Each of those miles per hour came from countless wind tunnel testing hours, from incremental improvements in propeller design and engine tuning, from desperate innovation under wartime pressure when there was no time for mistakes and lives hung in the balance. Speed, of course, wasn't everything in aerial combat. Maneuverability mattered, the ability to turn inside your opponent, to bring guns to bear first. Firepower mattered, heavy armament that could destroy an enemy with a single burst. Range mattered. The ability to fly deep into enemy territory with sufficient fuel to fight and return home. Reliability mattered. An aircraft breaking down or failing was worse than useless. And pilot skill mattered enormously. The best aircraft couldn't compensate for poor training or lack of experience. But in a war where seconds determined survival, where catching an enemy bomber before it reached its target could save thousands of innocent lives, where escaping when outnumbered meant living to fight another day, these aircraft gave pilots what mattered most. Options. The freedom to engage or evade, to press the attack, or preserve themselves for the next battle. That freedom, more than any technical specification, was what truly saved lives. Years after the war, according to accounts, pilots who had flown these aircraft visited the factories where they were built. They met women who had riveted fuselage panels, working long shifts in difficult conditions. They met men who had installed engines, carefully torquing each bolt to exact specifications. These were just regular people, factory workers doing their jobs, earning paychecks, going home to families at shift's end. But what they built, working together in those vast assembly halls, saved lives. Every fighter on this list represents thousands of people who never flew in combat, who never fired guns in anger, but whose work determined who lived and who died in the skies over Europe and the Pacific. These 8 aircraft proved what was possible at the absolute edge of piston engine technology, in those final years before jets would change everything. They represented an era's end that had begun with the Wright brothers' fragile biplane at Kitty Hawk and culminated in machines that could fly nearly 500 miles per hour, that could fight at 40,000 feet, that combined power and grace and deadly efficiency in ways their designers could barely have imagined just a decade earlier. 80 years later, aviation enthusiasts and historians still debate which of these fighters was truly the best. Speed? Handling? Versatility? Reliability? The answer depends on what you value, on what criteria you use, on whether you're thinking about specific mission profiles or the broader strategic picture. The arguments continue, good-natured and endless, in online forums and museum displays and gatherings of veterans who remember these aircraft not as statistics, but as living machines that responded to their touch, that carried them through danger, that brought them home when so many others didn't return. But perhaps the most important thing about these 8 aircraft isn't their top speed or kill ratios or technical specifications. Perhaps the most important thing is what they represented, the ultimate expression of human ingenuity and determination under pressure, proof that when everything is on the line, when stakes couldn't be higher, we can achieve things that seem impossible. Each of these fighters was built by people who refused to accept that good enough was adequate, who kept pushing and innovating and improving even when the task seemed hopeless, even when the war seemed lost, even when exhaustion and despair threatened to overwhelm them. The men who flew these aircraft, young men, most of them, barely out of their teens, facing dangers that would give nightmares to anyone who truly understood what they endured, knew something we sometimes forget in peacetime. They knew that excellence matters, that the difference between good and great can be measured in lives saved or lost, that a few extra miles per hour or slightly faster roll rate or better cockpit visibility could mean the difference between seeing another sunrise or becoming a name on a memorial wall. If you found this journey through aviation history compelling, if these stories of innovation, courage, and human achievement resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. We bring you more untold stories from history's most pivotal moments, honoring the people who shaped our world through their courage and sacrifice. Share this with anyone who appreciates aviation history or World War II stories. These accounts deserve to be remembered and shared with future generations. Now you know the 8 fastest propeller fighters of World War II. ranked by documented performance data verified and cross-checked by generations of historians and engineers. You know their speeds, their strengths, their stories, but more importantly, you know something about the people who built them and flew them, who risked everything and sometimes lost everything, who somehow found courage to climb into these machines day after day and face an enemy who was equally determined, equally brave, equally convinced of their cause's rightness. Speed was survival, and these aircraft represented survival perfected. They were the fastest of the fast, the best of the best, the ultimate achievement of the propeller era. And they remind us, 8 decades later, that human beings are capable of extraordinary things when we absolutely must be.